Here's what they never admit about Fech Lana. The writers didn't just bend continuity, they snapped it in half. The mythology surrounding Fech Lana rests on one glorious contradiction. He is allegedly made on the other side, yet speaks with the accentless ease of someone who grew up tormenting gym teachers in suburban New Jersey. If one takes the phrase literally, Feech should sound like an emissary from Palermo, not a man who could sell used Buicks in Passaic without raising suspicions. To be made in Italy in one's late 20s, then immigrate and somehow shed every trace of an Italian accent would require linguistic sorcery rarely witnessed outside language laboratories and fairy tales. Yet, within the show's universe, such details are treated with a shrug and a wave. The characters themselves seem dimly aware that the legend does not match the man. When the story of Feech's Italian induction is told, it is delivered with the kind of haziness that suggests mythologizing rather than history. The younger mobsters speak about him as if reciting folklore, half remembered, half invented, and wholly inaccurate. References to him as a Mustache Pete are particularly telling. The real Mustache Petes were early 20th century Sicilian patriarchs, largely extinct by the mid-1930s. To apply that label to a man who would have been hitting his stride in the 1970s is less a factual description than a rhetorical flourish. It is the same phenomenon that fuels Tony's naive reverence for the supposed nobility of his father's generation. Tales grow taller in proportion to the distance from the truth. And then there is the writer's room, where continuity goes to nap and wakes up 4 years later with no idea what it previously said. The Feech mentioned in the third season was a convenient bit of lore, meant to give Ralph an air of mob history expertise. Years later, when the desire arose to bring in a new character, and conveniently, a respected actor, Feech's name was plucked from the archives and attached to a fully realized man who bore little resemblance to his earlier description. The accent? Forgotten. The timeline? Misaligned. The writers simply repurposed the scrap of S3 lore and trusted the audience not to inspect the stitching too closely. Of course, Feech is hardly the show's only casualty of temporal whimsy. The sudden revelation of Tony Blundetto, a man allegedly so central to Tony Soprano's early life that he might as well have been his conjoined twin, arrives with no prior foreshadowing. Neither he nor his family, including the aunt who lived conveniently nearby, warranted so much as a whispered mention in earlier seasons. And yet, when the opportunity arose to give a gifted actor a substantial role, an entire backstory materialized overnight, complete with explanations for his absence that strained both credibility and psychiatry. A pivotal panic attack that shaped the course of Tony B's life somehow never came up in 5 years of therapy. A feat of narrative omission rivaled only by the show's sudden insistence that Silvio Dante had aged backward and sideways, depending on which era the writers wished to dramatize. The universe of the show, then, operates by a simple rule. Continuity is desirable but expendable, and character introductions obey the logic of casting opportunities rather than coherent chronology. Even the immortal bakery incident, featuring Vito in a cameo role that accidentally contradicted later depictions, spawned elaborate fan theories to explain it. At some point, the explanations themselves become more entertaining than the inconsistencies they attempt to patch. Back to Feech. Attempts to salvage his backstory often lean on hypotheticals. Perhaps he did arrive from Sicily in his 20s, lived in the US for 4 decades, and gradually lost his accent. Perhaps he was part of a later wave of mafiosi emigrating post-World War II, the so-called Zips, who maintained ties with Italy while integrating into American operations. Such scenarios are theoretically possible, though they do little to explain why a man who supposedly entered the country under such circumstances was never deported after serving a lengthy prison sentence. The simpler explanation is also the least glamorous. The timeline was bent to accommodate storytelling desires. Feech did not need to be a historically accurate relic of Sicilian tradition. He needed to be a vessel for Robert Loggia's formidable presence. His alleged past served primarily as color, a set of impressions passed around by men who inflate stories for effect and barely understand the terms they use. In that sense, the inconsistency becomes accidentally poetic. The mobsters who revere the old world cannot correctly describe it. They misapply labels, confuse eras, and elevate their own legends through sloppy retellings. Thus, Fech Lana occupies a space somewhere between fact and fable. A man who supposedly predates electric light, ruled Miami's cocaine corridors, and simultaneously arrived in America early enough and late enough to satisfy whatever narrative requirement happened to arise. His accent, his origins, his mythology, all fungible, all rearranged at the convenience of the moment. One could object that such inconsistencies break the illusion of realism. Yet the show itself repeatedly reminds viewers that stories in this world are rarely accurate, whether told by mobsters, their families, or even the characters' own memories. Continuity, much like honor, is whatever these men needed to be at the time. And Feech, accentless, ageless, and endlessly repurposed, is simply the most vivid embodiment of that principle.